Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. Wow, you guys have really sent in some incredible stuff about what's happening over in Syria right now. News reports, expert analysis, even some firsthand accounts. It's uh, it's a lot
It is.
to take in. But our mission today, I think, is pretty clear. We need to try to figure out how this sudden shift in power happened, who these new players are, and what it all means for Syria's future, and honestly, what it means for the world.
You're absolutely right. It is a pivotal moment. For years we've seen this Syrian conflict kind of frozen almost with Assad in control, backed by some very powerful allies. But now it's like somebody just hit fast forward,
Yeah.
lightning offensive. Aleppo falls in a matter of days. And even Assad's allies are looking a little caught off guard. It raises a lot of questions about what comes next.
Okay, let's dive into the details then. The speed of this rebel advance, it's really mind-blowing. I mean, Aleppo, this is Syria's largest city, and it just collapses.
Yeah.
Everyone, even Assad's own forces, they seem totally blindsided. Was there any indication that this was coming at all? What contributed to this intelligence failure?
Well, the sources you've sent in, they highlight a few key factors, I think.
Yeah.
Firstly, there does seem to have been a level of complacency on the part of the Assad regime. They'd been enjoying a period of relative stability, even sort of mending ties with some Arab countries, and perhaps they just underestimated the opposition's willingness to take such a bold step.
Complacency in the face of a group like Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS,
Huh.
the force leading this offensive. This is a group with a history linked to al-Qaeda. I mean, what's changed with them? What are they like now?
HTS is a complex entity. They claim to have cut ties with al-Qaeda, and on the surface, they've adopted a more pragmatic kind of approach, focusing on local governance and service provision in the areas that they control. However, concerns remain about their leadership and the presence of some of those foreign fighters within their ranks.
Yeah.
It's also really important to note that this offensive isn't solely driven by HTS. Other Turkish-backed factions, each with their own agendas and their own relationships with Ankara, are also playing a very significant role. So you're not looking at one monolithic force.
So it's not a single group.
It's a coalition.
Coalition with maybe some conflicting goals.
Yeah.
That raises questions about long-term, cohesion and how this is all going to play out.
Yeah.
But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's talk about what's happening right now on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
It's easy to get lost in all the geopolitical maneuvering, but
Yeah.
at the end of the day, this is about real people caught in the middle of a war.
Imagine being trapped in your home for days in Aleppo, a city under constant bombardment. Some of the material you've shared includes some firsthand accounts from aid workers, and they describe this incredible fear, desperation, the lack of just basic necessity. Over 5 million people were in Aleppo when this offensive began, facing shortages of food, water, medical care. And now the airstrikes have resumed bombing Aleppo for the first time since 2016.
Wow.
It's a terrifying situation.
You're right. It's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
We do have some firsthand accounts in the material you sent me, right? What are people saying? What are they?
One aid worker describes a scene of utter chaos, families huddled in basements, terrified, running out of supplies. They talk about the constant fear of being hit, the desperation to get their children to safety. This offensive has plunged millions back into a nightmare that they honestly thought was over.
It's a stark reminder that behind every headline, every territorial gain or loss, there are real lives being shattered by this conflict. This isn't just about, who controls a piece of land. It's about people struggling to survive another day.
Absolutely. And it raises a really important question. What happens next for these people? Where do they go? Who will provide them with aid and protection?
Let's shift gears for a moment and talk about the international actors involved, specifically Assad's allies, Russia, Iran, Hezbollah. They've been his lifeline throughout this entire conflict. Can they, or more importantly, will they come to his rescue now?
All three face their own set of challenges.
Yeah.
Russia's bogged down in its war in Ukraine.
Facing, significant resource constraints, international pressure. Iran is grappling with internal unrest and its own regional conflicts, particularly with Israel. And Hezbollah is still recovering from the recent war in Lebanon, facing depleted resources and internal divisions. So their ability and willingness to fully commit to propping Assad up is in question.
So their commitment is wavering? That raises a very real question. What happens if those allies don't step up? Could Assad actually lose control of the country his family has ruled for over 50 years? What would that even look like? It's a possibility that we can't ignore, and one with massive consequences. Syria has been a proxy battleground for regional and global powers for years. If the balance of power shifts so dramatically, it could trigger a cascade of unpredictable events. A power vacuum in Syria would be incredibly destabilizing, not just for the region, but potentially for the world.
And we can't forget about the United States. They've played a complex and often controversial role in Syria. What are your sources saying about how the U.S. is responding to this offensive? What are their options?
The main focus of the U.S. in Syria has been on the northeast supporting Kurdish-led forces against ISIS. This new offensive by HTS and their allies complicates things significantly. If the fighting spreads especially towards areas where the U.S. has troops stationed, they may be forced to make some very difficult decisions.
Do they intervene more directly?
Exactly. Do they risk further escalation, or do they pull back, potentially abandoning their Kurdish allies and creating a vacuum for other powers to exploit?
And we have the added layer of President Trump coming back into office, a figure known for his skepticism of interventionism. Could this change the U.S. approach to Syria? How might his foreign policy impact this situation?
It's certainly a factor to consider. President Trump has expressed a desire to withdraw U.S. troops from Syria in the past. This new offensive could give him further justification to do so, but it also creates risks. A U.S. withdrawal could embolden groups like HTS, further destabilize the region, and create opportunities for Russia and Iran to expand their influence.
And then there's a looming question of ISIS. With all this chaos and instability, could they make a comeback? They've been relatively quiet, but is that about to change?
The material you sent suggests that's a very real concern. While ISIS has been weakened, they've proven to be incredibly resilient and adaptable. They could exploit the current situation to recruit and launch new attacks. This offensive, regardless of who ultimately wins, creates the kind of instability and power vacuums that ISIS thrives in.
This all paints a pretty unsettling picture. So much is at stake: the lives of millions of Syrians, regional stability, the global fight against terrorism. What stands out to you as the most concerning element of this situation? Where do you see the greatest risks?
For me, the most immediate concern is the humanitarian crisis that's unfolding in Aleppo and other areas affected by the fighting. The scale of displacement, the lack of access to basic necessities, the risk of disease outbreaks. It's a catastrophe in the making. And with winter coming, the situation is only going to get worse.
Yeah, it's almost impossible to grasp the scale of suffering. You mentioned earlier that Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, is leading this offensive. They've tried to rebrand themselves, present a more moderate image, but they have a very troubling history. How are other countries viewing their involvement? Is this rebranding working?
It's definitely causing a lot of anxiety internationally. While HTS claims to have abandoned, its global jihadist ambitions, their ideology still aligns with some pretty extremist views. Their participation in this offensive raises serious concerns about the potential for a resurgence of radical groups in Syria.
That's a point that's been raised in some of the analysis you sent me, right? What are the experts saying about the potential for groups like ISIS to exploit this situation?
Yeah, several experts warn that the instability and power vacuums created by this offensive could provide fertile ground for ISIS to regroup and stage a comeback. They point to the fact that ISIS has been exploiting similar situations in other parts of the world, particularly in Africa and South Asia. The concern is that Syria could become another safe haven for them to recruit, train, and launch attacks.
And that would be a nightmare scenario, not just for Syria, but for the entire region and beyond.
Absolutely. It could destabilize the whole region, potentially drawing in other countries and leading to a much wider conflict. And, we know that ISIS has global ambitions. They haven't given up on their goal of establishing a caliphate. A resurgence in Syria would give them a significant platform to project their ideology and potentially inspire attacks in other parts of the world.
It feels like we're trying to solve a really complex puzzle with pieces that are constantly shifting. Are there any potential paths toward a resolution, or are we just staring down the barrel of more violence and suffering?
Well, it's impossible to predict the future with certainty. The situation is incredibly fluid and volatile. However, we can identify some key factors that I think will shape the trajectory of the conflict.
Let's break those down. What should we be paying attention to in the coming weeks and months? What are the key things to watch?
The first and perhaps most crucial factor is the response of Assad's allies. Will Russia and Iran double down on their support, pouring more resources and manpower into propping up the regime? Or will they start to distance themselves from Assad, recognizing that his grip on power is weakening? Their calculations will be heavily influenced by their own domestic situations, their regional ambitions, and their assessment of the U.S. response.
So the level of international involvement, particularly from the U.S., is another critical factor. Will the international community led by the U.S. intervene more directly, either diplomatically or militarily, or will they choose to remain on the sidelines? What's the appetite for further involvement in Syria?
You've hit the nail on the head. The U.S. in particular faces a really difficult dilemma. On the one hand, they have a strategic interest in preventing the resurgence of ISIS and containing Iranian influence in the region. But on the other hand, they're wary of getting entangled in another protracted conflict, especially with a president who's expressed, a strong desire to reduce U.S. military commitments overseas.
And then there's the internal dynamics within the opposition itself. This offensive has united a diverse array of groups with different ideologies and agendas. Can they maintain this momentum and cohesion? Can they govern the territories they've captured? Or will their internal divisions and rivalries undermine their gains, potentially leading to infighting and further chaos?
Several of the sources you shared emphasize this point. There's a real risk that the various opposition groups with their different visions for the future of Syria could turn on each other. And if that happens, it could create an even more dangerous power vacuum, one that allows even more extreme groups to flourish.
So in essence, the fate of Syria hinges on this delicate balance of power between Assad and the opposition, between Russia, Iran, and the U.S., and even within the opposition ranks themselves.
That's a very astute observation, and right now that balance is teetering precariously. Even a slight shift in one direction or the other could have dramatic and far-reaching consequences.
And we can't forget about the human cost. We've discussed the displacement, the fear, the immediate crisis. But what about the long-term impact on the Syrian people? What about the trauma, the loss, the shattered dreams?
The material you sent includes some incredibly poignant reflections on that very issue. One Syrian writer describes this profound sense of loss of innocence, the feeling that an entire generation has been robbed of its future. They talk about the erosion of trust, the fragmentation of communities, the deep psychological wounds that may take generations to heal.
That's incredibly powerful and heartbreaking.
It is, and it highlights the need to address not just the immediate humanitarian crisis, but also the deep-seated psychological and social damage inflicted by this conflict. Rebuilding Syria will require more than just bricks and mortar. It will require a concerted effort to heal those wounds, to foster reconciliation, to provide psychosocial support, and to create opportunities for young people to rebuild their lives and rediscover hope for the future.
It's not just about stopping the fighting, it's about rebuilding lives, communities, and entire societies shattered by years of war.
Precisely. And that will require a sustained and multifaceted commitment from the international community, not just humanitarian aid, but also support for education, healthcare, economic development, and most importantly, justice and accountability for the atrocities that have been committed.
Let's shift our focus to another crucial player, Turkey. They've been deeply involved in the Syrian conflict from the outset, supporting various opposition groups. What role are they playing in this latest offensive? What are their goals in Syria?
Turkey has maintained a relatively low profile in this specific offensive. However, their influence in northern Syria remains significant. They control a large swath of territory and have backed several of the groups involved in this offensive. Their actions suggest a strategy of calculated ambiguity, seeking to advance their interests without directly confronting either the Assad regime or its allies.
So they're playing a kind of shadow game using proxy forces to pursue their own interests. What exactly are those interests?
Turkey's primary objective in Syria is to prevent the establishment of an autonomous Kurdish state along its border. They see the Syrian Kurdish groups, particularly the YPG, as an extension of the PKK, which Turkey considers a terrorist organization. Turkey fears that an independent Kurdish state in Syria would embolden Kurdish separatists within Turkey itself, further destabilizing the region and threatening Turkish security.
And that explains their support for groups like HTS, even though they are designated as a terrorist organization by many countries. It seems like a risky strategy supporting a group with such a troubling history.
It's a complex and controversial calculus. Turkey seems to view HTS as a useful tool to counter the Kurdish forces, even if it means turning a blind eye to their extremist ideology and human rights abuses. It's a dangerous game, one that could backfire and have serious consequences for Turkey's own stability.
So essentially they're walking a tightrope, trying to balance their security concerns with the risk of empowering extremist groups and further destabilizing Syria.
Exactly. And the outcome of this balancing act remains uncertain. Turkey's actions in Syria are having a significant impact on the course of the conflict, but their long-term strategy remains unclear. Are they genuinely committed to a negotiated settlement, or are they simply seeking to create a sphere of influence in northern Syria, further fragmenting the country and prolonging the suffering of the Syrian people?
It's a stark reminder that the Syrian conflict isn't just a proxy war between global powers. It's also a battleground for regional rivalries and competing agendas. It feels like we're at a crossroads, with so many potential paths forward, each with its own set of risks and rewards. What stands out to you as the most crucial factor that will determine what happens next? Where does the real power to shape events lie?
I think while those geopolitical forces, international actors, they exert, immense influence, but I really believe that the most crucial factor lies with the Syrian people themselves. I mean, they've endured over a decade of unimaginable suffering, and yet their resilience, their determination to survive, to rebuild, it's truly awe-inspiring.
That really does come through in the personal stories and reflections that you sent over. The strength of the human spirit is just incredible.
It is. Despite the trauma, the loss, the shattered dreams, they haven't given up hope.
Hmm.
They're still fighting for a better future for themselves and their children. They yearn for peace, for stability, for the chance to reclaim their lives and rebuild their communities.
It's so easy to get caught up in the high-level analysis, the geopolitical chess game. But ultimately, it's their voices, their stories that matter most. Their struggle is a stark reminder of the human cost of conflict, a cost that's often overlooked in the grand strategic calculations of world leaders.
Absolutely. And that's what makes this conflict so heartbreaking. The Syrian people have been trapped in this web of competing interests, their lives and aspirations just sacrificed on the altar of geopolitical ambitions and regional power struggles.
So the key to resolving this conflict, to ending the bloodshed and creating a sustainable peace, it lies not just in negotiations between diplomats and world leaders, but in empowering the Syrian people to shape their own destiny.
Absolutely. It's about amplifying their voices, supporting their initiatives, and ensuring that any peace process is inclusive and responsive to their needs and aspirations. It's about recognizing their agency, their resilience, and their right to self-determination.
That's a powerful message, and one that needs to be heard loud and clear. The world cannot afford to turn its back on the Syrian people. The stakes are just too high, not just for Syria and the region, but for global peace and security.
Yeah.
The consequences of inaction, of allowing this conflict to just fester and spread, are simply too grave to contemplate.
Well, this deep dive has revealed a complex and multifaceted crisis, a web of shifting alliances, competing agendas, and a humanitarian catastrophe of just immense proportions. But it's also illuminated the extraordinary resilience of the Syrian people, their determination to survive, and their yearning for a just and lasting peace.
We've uncovered some of the forces driving the conflict, the potential scenarios that lie ahead, and the critical factors that will shape the future of Syria. But as we wrap up this deep dive, one fundamental question still remains. Will the international community rise to the challenge? Will they prioritize the needs and aspirations of the Syrian people and work together to forge a path towards a peaceful and sustainable future? Or will they succumb to inertia and allow this tragedy to continue with potentially devastating consequences for Syria, the region, and the world? That's something for you to ponder as you continue to follow this unfolding story and engage with the complex issues it raises.